Hey everybody! In today's video, I am going to paint some of Texas's finest wildflowers. In this sped up video, I will be painting bluebonnets and Indian paintbrushes, which have kind of a similar flower structure, actually very similar, except one is red and one is blue. We have had a banner wildflower year here because we had kind of a wet winter. And so our highways and our meadows have been filled with beautiful flowers, and that is where I'm getting my inspiration from today. Now I'm stamping 5 of these. I'm going to end up die cutting these, but I'm maximizing my use of a piece of 5x7 cold press watercolor paper. And I will be cutting them all out at the end. And I'm going to talk a little bit about watercolor paper and give you a little memory trick here in a second. But first, I always try to look at a reference photo, even though bluebonnets are something that I know so well. I still like to just refresh myself on where the colors in the image are, and if there are little pops of like this purple right here or yellow, just kind of remembering where those are on the flower always helps me. And then looking at the foliage, the structure of the flower, where the little white parts that are so classic of a bluebonnet are, it just really helps me just to Google an image if I want to paint something realistic, which I don't always. But the petal structure and all that can be really informative when you go to watercolor an image. So just take a second and Google what you're painting if you're doing a floral, and I really think it will help you choose the right pigments for your project and also just learn botanical painting a little bit. So I will be using my Daniel Smith watercolor. I have a wide variety of reds in my G split from my watercolor split group, and I'll be using those for the Indian paintbrushes, and the foliage will be the same on all of them. So let me give you, before we start the sped up portion, let me give you my memory trick for what kind of watercolor paper to use. I've said this many times in my lives, but I'm going to memorialize it here for anybody who likes to watch sped up watercolor videos. The way you can remember what the difference is between cold press watercolor and hot press watercolor is to think of your least favorite, or my least favorite task, which would be ironing. I am in a portion of my life where I no longer purchase clothes that have to be ironed because the iron is not the boss of me, nor is society. So you can see from my close-up that the surface of this paper is rough, as in not ironed. And that is the way that you remember cold press watercolor paper. Hot press watercolor, as if it had been ironed by some sort of psychopath who likes ironing, is a very smooth surface for watercolor. A lot of stampers like to stamp in watercolor on hot press paper. I do not, and you will not see me doing any kind of serious painting on hot press watercolor paper because the surface is not as durable and I cannot paint properly on it. I do use hot press watercolor paper for water-friendly type techniques, ink smushing, things like that. But if I'm actually painting and I want to be able to use water the way that I like to use water in watercolor, I need the durability and the reactive surface of cold press watercolor paper. So cold, rough, textured. Hot press, as if it had been ironed by a psychotic person who likes ironing. So there's your little tip for today. Now let me talk about what I am doing here. Each little petal of a bluebonnet or a paintbrush have a little white tip on the end, and the base of the petal structure is either blue or red. I am starting with a sort of mid-tone for both of these flowers. So I have a lot of pigment and a little bit of water. And I'm starting at the bottom of that petal structure, and I'm adding this kind of medium color, blue or red. Then I go back on top of that with just a wet paintbrush, and I pull out a little bit of that color to create a lighter blue or a lighter red. Then when the whole thing is dry, I come back with mostly pigment, as much pigment and as little water as I possibly can. And I add a very, very dark pop of blue or red to the bottommost portion of the petals. This is how I watercolor everything. You're going to see it with the leaves as well. I start with a midtone, I come in with a dark accent, and I use water just for the light. There's a lot of kind of going back and forth between dark, light, and medium tones when you watercolor. And this is the process that I find to be the most reliable for painting. The last portion where I come in and I put the darkest pigments down, which you will see here in just a minute, is a wet on dry technique, meaning that I've let my paper completely dry before I do that step. And that's what allows me to get very crisp details. What you're seeing right now is just the wet paintbrush portion where I'm creating those lighter blues in the bluebonnets. So this is just water on my paintbrush, and I'm just activating the pigment that's already on the page to create the filled in lighter colors of those petals. And you can see I'm not being super careful about it. This is a very easy part of painting a bluebonnet or a paintbrush. And it's simple, but you can see how much depth and dimension having that lighter color adds to those little petals. But seriously, I'm just going over it very quickly. I'm not really paying attention to where I'm putting my paintbrush so much, as long as I pick up a little bit of that pigment and spread it around. Now here's the section where I come in with the dark colors, both on the foliage and on the petals of the flowers themselves. And immediately you start to see that it becomes more realistic and lifelike. This is the step that matters the most. Very end of your painting, always do wet paint on dry paper. That gives you a lot of precision with your paintbrush and lets you put those details in that we're finally going to make that image really pop, whereas before this, it was somewhat more abstract. So that's just kind of my overall method for watercolor painting. You've seen it in some of my other videos, but this was the perfect image to do that on because I need that mid-tone light and dark to make these plants look realistic and make them really look how they look in real life all over Texas in the spring. So here they are side by side. You can see that it really does look like a bluebonnet. They did the foliage perfectly on these flowers. There is a little bit of a Texas connection there at that company. And so it was very fun to see such a beloved flower that we see on our highways every spring, and just makes us proud to be Texans. So this is the die that I will be cutting these out with, and you'll see this in just a second on the finished card. It's a nice close cutting die so that you can sort of group these together, and it lets you maximize that pricey watercolor paper. And the no line coloring ink lets you still see the white tips of the flowers that make bluebonnets and paintbrushes the unique florals that they are. So here's the finished card. Head over to my blog for more information, and thanks so much for watching.